And you hear it twice. Pleasures may be divided into 6 classes, to wit, food, drink, clothes, sex, scent, and sound. Of these, the noblest and most consequential is food. This classification of pleasures is taken from, as you know, al-Baghdadi's compilation, cookery book. Compilation and hierarchizations of pleasures are to be found widely in classical Arabic literature. My present paper deals with the pleasure of food, but also of sex and language in the framework of the 19th century transformation processes in Europe and the Arab world. Pleasure, ladha, is defined in al-Firuzabadi's influential post-classical dictionary al-Qamus al-Muhit as the opposite of pain. Unlike desire, raghba, or appetite, shahwa, it emphasizes not the motivational aspect of wanting or getting something, but the sensorial aspect of feeling something to be good. Well, the concepts of pleasure and desire is certainly shifting in different texts and contexts. My paper focuses on positive and negative corporeal sensations towards food. That means on the pain and pleasure of consumption food. Such a reading stems from an emerging field of research highlighting the importance of the body. While it seems quite obvious that every human has a body, it is less obvious that every human is a body. It is the difference between the body as a material object formed by society and so on, and the body experienced by the senses as part of the self. This latter is called in English corporeal or somatic experience. In German it is leibliche Erfahrung. The relevance of body politics to society has been, of course, discussed for quite a long time. But the relevance of the somatic experience and its agency is a relatively new field of research. And that is also true for Nahda studies. While the various transformation processes in the Arab 19th century have often been studied through the lens of key ideas and great narratives like liberalism, secularism, or nationalism, some new studies put body, affect, and feeling at center stage. Shadon Taqeddin, for instance, reads cultural imperialism as seduction of translation, and Tarek El-Ariss discovers in the literary affects the new political. In regard to food, El-Ariss discusses the factual travelogue Kashf al-Mukhabba of the 19th century Ahmad Faris al-Shidyaq, where the digesting body becomes a site of cultural negotiation. Following this insight, my paper focused today on somatic aspects of food consumption. The act of digestion may technically be described as a way to make an object of the world temporarily part of your somatic self. It is a kind of radical incorporation of the world into the self. Against this background, I understand food consumption as a very intimate world contact. Reading another text of al-Shidyaq, namely, as mentioned, his fictional travelogue al-Saq, l-saq, I argue that consuming food in pleasure or pain offers a somatic critique of Arab and European 19th century modernities. The somatic experience of food reveals here shortcomings and promises of different modernities. Al-Shidyaq is an eccentric figure of Arab 19th century. Born into a Maronite family in Mount Lebanon, he converted to Protestantism and later to Islam. He translated the Bible and penned simultaneously a Bible critique. Having a life in motion, he moved from Mount Lebanon to Egypt, Malta, Britain, France, Tunis, and Istanbul finally, while he was one of the greatest 19th century thinkers of Arab culture and language. He lived most of his life outside the Arab world, an experience that provided him with an even more critical and radical perspective on the self and the other. In Paris, he wrote and published at the beginning of the 1850s his literary work al-Saq al-saq fima huwa al-Faryaq. Humphrey Davis has recently translated this to the title's prose rhyme quite brilliantly, as I think, as leg over leg of the turtle in the tree, concerning the Faryaq, what manner of creature might he be. It's a satirical, philological, and out-of-fictional account of al-Shidyaq's own life and opinions on Arab and European culture and society. It basically narrates the story of al-Faryaq, who moves from Mount Lebanon to Egypt, Malta, England, and finally France. When he marries in Egypt, his wife al-Faryaq accompanies him on his journeys and offers, and that's quite new, a female Arab perspective. In my analysis, however, I concentrate exclusively on the protagonist's consumption of food. I analyze 5 different eating scenes, namely al-Faryaq eating with the monks in Mount Lebanon, with Protestant missionaries in Malta, with Britons in Malta and in Britain, and finally with his wife in Egypt. And I discuss the protagonist's, okay, I hope you're fine. I discuss the protagonist's somatic experience in these eating scenes on 3 levels, namely the act of consumption itself, the manner of eating, and the metaphoric consumption when language is consumed like food. The protagonist loves eating, but most of the eating scenes are full of pain, not of pleasure. That is because al-Faryaq is a notorious unlucky fellow. His experiences are not only, he experiences not only the occasional bad luck, but his misfortune is part of his very nature and body. His misfortune is, quote, like the blood that courses through the body's every joint and member, the breastbone, the polyps, the vertebrae tips, the osmotic membrane, and so on and so forth. Misfortune is really part of his own body, and as a consequence, he experiences all the social and cultural drawbacks in his own body. He feels them. This kind of misfortune is a handicap, of course, on the one side, but a gift on the other side. It is an idiosyncratic aesthesia or sensibility for problems. Often, before he intellectually understands a problem, he somatically feels it. Somatic sensations offer an a priori ground for intellectual reasoning, and in this regard he anticipates to some degree the 20th century new somatic phenomenology of philosophers like Hermann Schmitz, for instance. One day, al-Faryaq enters a monastery in Mount Lebanon and eats with the monks. The monk's dry bread nearly breaks one of his teeth, and the lentils cause a pain in his stomach, after which he starts scratching his belly and his skin gets raw and bloody. The shortcoming of Catholic asceticism are first to be discovered by the body, and only later by the mind. Being a poet, al-Faryaq wants to take this self-healing revenge by writing an invective hijab poem on the asceticism, but when he asks the monks for a dictionary, a qamus, they only understand words like jazus and kabus, and jamus, buffalo, spy, and nightmare. This reveals a double aesthetic abstention both to food and to language. The following morning, al-Faryaq confronts a monk about his experience of ascetic food and language. There is no harm in eating good food like meat and even drinking wine, he argues. God wants man to enjoy his life, laugh, and have a strong bodily constitution. Otherwise, he wouldn't have created this kind of food. And for the public weal and welfare, monks should not be unproductive, he says, but write useful books for their contemporaries. Abstention from food and language, as he had suffered it with his own body, is not a way to worship God, al-Faryaq adds. Finally, the monk confesses to being depressed about his ascetic life. Quote, I see my body wasting away day by day and my spirit becomes dejected, says the monk. And in the end, he leaves the monastery and the protagonist concludes, satirically of course, I swear, if I were to free a monk or a novice, or at least a nun or a novice nun, every time I ate lentils, I would want to eat nothing else as long as I should live, and even if lentils consumed my body. May God reward the monastery well. This anecdote is part of al-Shidyaq's harsh critique of Catholicism, where the attitude towards the body and the Arabic language plays a central role. Importantly, it is the protagonist's unfortunate somatic experience that catalyzes and delivers this anti-clerical critique. While some of al-Saq's critique on Catholicism are influenced by Protestantism, the protagonist by no means experiences a better life with the Protestant missionaries. Fleeing from the Catholic Church in Mount Lebanon, he stays with a Protestant missionary in Malta. This missionary is used to eat nothing but pork. The pork head, the pork feet, pork liver, pork spleen, and so on. Following the tradition of Levantine Christians, the protagonist doesn't eat pork but feels disgusted by it. The foreign host doesn't recognize that his guests, quote, intestines grew lean and shriveled up until emaciation reduced him to a pitiful state. His molar becomes rusty, so little he ate. And that's such that Humphrey Davis brilliantly translated in the English. And al-Faryaq finally loses 2 teeth on each side. The loss of teeth embodies the beginning of a much larger discomfort with Protestant missionaries' way of life, with their egoism towards the Oriental culture in regard to food, music, and language. In the end, the protagonist breaks up with the missionaries. Years later, a newlywed, he returns with his wife to Malta. Soon he finds himself invited by a Briton. While very hospitable at first glance, the Briton in fact turns out to be making subtle fun of him. When the couple comes to his home for the invited dinner, the hosts leave them waiting for hours. In the meantime, the couple witnesses how the mother and daughter of the host receive a male guest who even starts kissing the daughter. The couple turn yellow and red in anger and embarrassment and start a matrimonial dialogue on the different kissing cultures. While the Western culture allows for kissing in public spaces, the Arab culture worships the kiss as an intimate, erotic interaction, as Arabic poetry proves. This leads to quite delicate questions like how to consume saliva. Quote, can the lover find pleasure in drinking salivary secretions from any part other than the mouth? Al-Faryaq asks, and al-Faryaq answers, quite possibly, where some of the Arabs are concerned, but the Franks object to doing so, even from the mouth. Indeed, the only name they know for such a thing is spittle. In this passage, there is no real eating scene with the Britons, but there's a kind of, as I would like to call it, a Satz eating theme, fastening out the joyful consumption not of food, but this time, but of saliva and other bodily fluids in the framework of the Arab ars erotica. Significantly, the chapter's title is A Banquet and Various Kinds of Hot Sauce. The walima of the chapter's title is not, of course, the British banquet, but the Arabic language. And I leave it to your imagination what the various kinds of hot sauce could be. While eating with Britons in Malta is no pleasure, neither is eating with them in Britain. After the beginning of the Victorian era, the protagonists detect very well what later was called the body technique of Victorianism that excessively regulates, for instance, table manners. One must not eat or drink joyfully, the protagonist emphasizes, but, quote, their way of eating consists of snacking and picking and pecking and nibbling and tasting and testing and chewing over and over again, while their way of drinking consists of sipping little by little, bit by bit, drop by drop, slowly, slowly, listlessly, and unenthusiastically. While the protagonist here blames Victorian table manners for excessive regulations of eating, he at the same time celebrates pre-modern Arabic synonyms that can so accurately vivisect 19th century British modernity and its shortcomings in regard to the body and its pleasure. While al-Saq excessively expresses al-Faryaq's pleasure in the Arabic language, does it then also describe his pleasure in food? Embarking with his wife on a ship in the wide green Nile Delta in Egypt, he meets, quote, one of the greatest pleasures that makes his heart open, as the text literally says. Here, al-Faryaq enjoys the delicious food from the Egyptian countrysides in the daytime, as he enjoys the nights with his wife. The toyiban, the two good things, namely food and sex, are here the greatest pleasures that makes his heart open. While in sharaha sadruhu is an idiomatic Arabic expression for being delighted and rejoiced, the Somatic draws attention to the somatic dimension of such linguistic idioms. As Thomas Fuchs writes, die Leibvergessenheit der Moderne, the modern oblivion of the Soma, made us believe that all references and allusions to the Soma, of which languages hold so many, are only metaphors. The somatic rereading of experience, as Fuchs demands and others, has therefore to reread linguistic metaphors like the open heart and try to take them literally. Indeed, the German philosopher of the Soma, Hermann Schmitz, speaks about the feeling of corporeal whiteness as a feeling of somatic relaxation. While al-Faryaq, our unlucky protagonist, enjoys here the whiteness and relaxation, he more often experiences the tightness and spasm. He is more often dayiq as-sadr. It is, as the text shows us, a tightness and spasm of the 19th century project of a modern civilization that leaves, at least for the misfit al-Faryaq, not much room for his pleasures. The somatic experience of al-Faryaq, I argue, delivers in al-Saq a critique of European and Arab modernities. It foregrounds the somatic experience of eating, but also includes somatic experiences of music, language, and sexual intercourse in a changing time. The body, or more precisely, the somatic experience, is a negotiation of modernity. While the relationship between food and sex is, of course, quite obvious, the relationship between food and language is also important. As Gerd van Gelder has shown, the literary text of adab is sometimes conceived of as a banquet. This is also true for the words in al-Saq. In the book's opening proem, a kind of captatio benevolentia for the reader, the lyrical eye praises the reader the many enumerations of words. Quote, "I've licensed you, dear reader, to swallow these words as a whole, or to lick them. Or, if you're afraid of vomiting, you can take them diluted." Reading here is an act of digesting words, taking them into the mouth, articulating them with the tongue, making them part of the living somatic body. Language, too, can be part of somatic experience. And as I've argued in my dissertation, the somatic experience of Arabic delivers in al-Saq an elaborated cultural and social critique. To conclude, al-Saq foregrounds how the protagonist somatically feels and evaluates the different modernities of his time by eating. With such a somatic self-consciousness, al-Saq is certainly an exceptional text of the Nahda, though marginalized texts like the autobiographical writings of the 18th century mystic Hindi al-Ojami do well provide fascinating examples of somatic experience and also in regard to food. While more classical texts of the Nahda, like from Rifa'a Tahtawi, hold somatic traces that have yet to be uncovered. My analysis argues for a reading of pleasure and pain in Nahda literature as a kind of somatic negotiation of modernity. While the somatic experience may refer to all parts of the human body, I want to draw attention especially to the mouth, to what I want to call the oral contact zone of cultures. As a German scholar of cultural studies, Hartmut Böhme argued in a recent study on the oral, the mouth is the second birthplace of the human, where his subjectivity significantly emerges. Translating this insight to my reading, the mouth is part of the body where different forms of consumption or incorporations take place. Eating, drinking, of course, but also kissing, singing, speaking. When we think of post-colonial zones of contact, we should also think of the mouth, how it feels to eat, drink, to kiss, speak, and how it feels to take a certain part of the world in the mouth. Thank you very much.